My name is Daniel Whitaker, and I grew up in a house where words were measured, emotions were rationed, and memories were rewritten as needed. My father, Charles Whitaker, was a man of order. He believed in discipline, structure, and above all else, control. My mother, Evelyn, was his quiet shadow, always present but never really seen. And then there was my younger brother, Ryan, the golden child, the prodigy, the son my father actually wanted. I used to think our family was normal, that this was just how things were. But looking back now, I see that it wasn't normal at all. It was a house built on unspoken rules. Rule number 1, don't ask questions. Rule number 2, don't disappoint Dad. Rule number 3, don't bring up the fire. I was 7 years old the night our house burned down. I don't remember much, just smoke, heat, my mother's frantic hands shoving me out the front door. The firefighters said it was an electrical fire, something about old wiring sparking in the walls. But I remember something else. I remember waking up before the fire started. I remember seeing my father in the hallway, and I remember the smell of gasoline. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just confused. But even at that age, I understood rule number 1. I didn't ask questions. I let the story be what my father said it was. We moved into a new house within weeks. A bigger one, better, like the fire had somehow been a gift. My father barely seemed shaken. If anything, he was relieved, like he had been waiting for a fresh start. Life went on. By the time I was in my 20s, I had long since learned my place. Ryan was the son who followed in my father's footsteps. Top of his class, ambitious, everything I wasn't. I was the one who drifted, who changed majors 3 times in college, who took a job at a publishing house instead of joining the family's real estate business. I was tolerated. Ryan was celebrated. And yet, for all my father's favoritism, I knew Ryan wasn't happy either. He had the same quiet desperation in his eyes that my mother did, the same look of someone suffocating under the weight of my father's expectations. Then my mother died. It was sudden, an aneurysm, the doctors said. No warning, no time for goodbyes. One moment she was fine, the next she was gone. That was when the cracks in our family started to show. At the funeral, I watched my father shake hands with guests, accept condolences with a stiff nod, never once letting his mask slip. Ryan stood beside him, mirroring every movement. But I saw the way his fingers clenched into fists at his sides, the way his jaw stayed tight like he was holding something back. 2 weeks later, Ryan stopped answering my calls. At first, I thought he just needed space. We had never been particularly close, but something about the way he disappeared felt different. Then, one night, I got a message. It was from Ryan's number, but it wasn't like any text he'd ever sent before. We were never supposed to find out. Don't trust him. If anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. And then, the next morning, Ryan was gone. The official story was an accident. His car was found at the bottom of a ravine, crumpled beyond recognition. The police said it looked like he lost control on a sharp turn, that it was likely instant. But I knew better. Ryan had never been reckless. He was always careful, always precise. And then there was his message, the warning he had sent me just hours before he died. I didn't believe it was an accident. And for the first time in my life, I was ready to break rule number 1. I was going to ask questions. Because whatever Ryan had found out, whatever had made him send that message, was something worth killing for. And I had a feeling my father knew exactly what it was. Losing Ryan changed something in me. For most of my life, I had lived in a state of willful ignorance, brushing off the unease that settled in my gut whenever I thought too deeply about my father's actions. It was easier to pretend that things were normal, that our family functioned like any other, that the past didn't contain unanswered questions. But silence had cost me my brother, and I was done pretending. I started by going back to the one place I had avoided for years, my mother's house. She had left it to Ryan and me, but my father never set foot inside after she passed. It was a modest place, quiet, tucked into a neighborhood where people still left their doors unlocked and nodded politely as they passed on the sidewalk. The air inside was thick with dust, but her presence remained in every detail. Her books lined the shelves, her knitting lay unfinished on the armrest of the couch, and the faint scent of her favorite perfume still clung to the curtains, as if the house itself refused to let go of her memory. I went straight to the study, to the corner desk where Ryan used to sit, his laptop open, brows furrowed in concentration. He had always been the inquisitive one, the one who wanted answers. And now, his laptop was the only thing that might provide them. I powered it on, my hands cold and stiff, and typed the first password that came to mind. It worked. His desktop was a mess. Files scattered across the screen. Unfinished notes saved in hastily labeled folders. But one folder stood out immediately. Dad. The moment I opened it, my pulse pounded in my ears. Pages of scanned documents filled the screen, bank statements, legal papers, old property deeds. At first, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. And then I saw the report. The fire. The fire that destroyed our childhood home when I was 7. The fire that took everything we had and forced us into a new life built on insurance payouts and whispered reassurances that it had been an accident. But Ryan had highlighted something in red. Accelerants detected. Gasoline. Beneath it, in his handwriting, was a single question. Then why did Dad tell us it was faulty wiring? My stomach twisted as I kept scrolling. He had gone deeper, found more emails between my father and a law firm, all sent in the weeks before the fire. There were discussions about financial trouble, warnings of an upcoming audit. And then, the message that made my skin turn ice cold. I need this handled before the audit next quarter. The house is more valuable to me gone than standing. A rush of memories hit me all at once. The heavy scent of gasoline that night. My father awake when he shouldn't have been. The way he steered us away from questions, controlled the narrative. Ryan had known the truth. He had uncovered what I had spent my entire life trying to forget. And now he was dead. I shut the laptop, my heart pounding. My father hadn't just let our house burn. He had wanted it to burn. For money. For a way out of his bad investments. He had played the grieving victim while cashing the checks that put him back on solid ground. I gripped my phone, my mind racing. The police wouldn't care about decades-old financial schemes. And my father was powerful, connected. He had spent his whole life bending reality to fit his needs. He could do it again. I needed more than old documents. I needed something concrete. And there was only one person who might have answers, Linda, my father's second wife. I had barely spoken to her since my mother's funeral. She had entered our lives as a perfectly polished extension of my father's world. Elegant, calculated, always in control. I had assumed she was just another person under his influence, another piece of his carefully constructed image. But now I wasn't so sure. When I found her, I was surprised by how calm she looked, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. There was no shock, no denial, just a quiet resignation that unsettled me. She reached into her bag without hesitation and handed me an envelope. Ryan had come to her too. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper, a letter in Ryan's handwriting. The moment I saw his words, my breath caught in my throat. He had been afraid. He had suspected that he wouldn't make it out of this fight, that he was up against something bigger than he realized. He had left this letter as a last resort, as a way to make sure I would know the truth if something happened to him. He had found something even worse than the fire. Our mother's will had been changed before she died. She had left everything to Ryan and me, but our father had never told us. He had buried the truth, kept it hidden, ensured that we remained in the dark. And Ryan had been close to proving it when he disappeared. I sat frozen, the paper trembling in my hands. Everything I had known about my father was unraveling. The fire, the money, the manipulation, it had all been leading to this moment. He had spent his life crafting a reality where he was untouchable, where he controlled every piece of the story. But he had underestimated Ryan. And now he had underestimated me. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. The truth was buried somewhere in my father's world. In his offices, in the documents he thought no one would ever see. If my mother had changed her will, the real version still had to exist. I just had to find it. And I wasn't alone. Linda had given me the letter without hesitation. She hadn't defended my father, hadn't tried to cover for him. She knew something. She had been waiting for this moment, too. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of my father. He had spent years controlling everything, silencing questions, rewriting history. But he had never prepared for this. He had never planned for someone to fight back. I was done staying silent. The truth was within reach. And I was going to make sure that this time my father didn't get to rewrite it. I didn't sleep that night. After reading Ryan's letter over and over, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts unraveling into knots I couldn't untangle. My father had spent years crafting a reality that suited him, manipulating the truth to keep himself in control. But this time he had miscalculated. Ryan had left a trail. Not just the letter, he had found something. And if he had found it, so could I. By sunrise, I knew what I had to do. I drove straight to my father's office downtown. the place where he built his empire, the fortress of paperwork and steel that protected his carefully curated version of the world. I walked in like I belonged there because, in a way, I did. I was his son, his blood. I had spent years in the shadows of his ambition, but today, I was stepping into the light. The receptionist greeted me with polite indifference. My father had long since made it clear that I was an afterthought in his life, and his employees treated me as such. I used that to my advantage. When I reached the elevators, I bypassed his floor and went straight to legal. My mother's will had been changed. That meant there was a real version somewhere, one that had never been meant to see the light of day. I had to find it. The legal department was a quiet maze of glass offices and heavy wooden doors, each one labeled with the name of an attorney whose job was to keep my father's affairs in order. I didn't know exactly where to start, but I knew someone who might. Linda. She had given me Ryan's letter without hesitation. That meant she had already picked a side. I called her as I stepped into an empty conference room. The phone rang twice before she answered, her voice low, careful. I told her where I was. I expected hesitation, maybe a warning to back off. Instead, she gave me a name. George Halston, Senior Legal Advisor. The man who had handled my father's most private dealings for over 20 years. And, as it turned out, the man who had overseen the change to my mother's will. I found his office at the end of the hallway, its frosted glass door slightly ajar. The nameplate gleamed under the overhead lights. My pulse pounded as I stepped inside. The office smelled like old books and expensive cologne, a place where secrets were tucked neatly into manila folders and locked away in cabinets that no one questioned. I scanned the room, my eyes landing on a row of filing cabinets against the wall. My fingers trembled as I pulled open the first drawer. At first, it was nothing: contracts, tax filings, agreements stamped with my father's name. But then, buried beneath a thick stack of old case files, I found it. The original will. My mother's signature was there, clear and unaltered. She had left everything to Ryan and me. Not to my father. Not to his second family. To us. My breath caught in my throat. Ryan had been right all along. My father had stolen what was ours. He had buried the truth, twisted it to suit his needs, rewritten our lives without a second thought. I snapped a picture of the document with my phone, then another, making sure every word was preserved. And then, for good measure, I took the entire folder. If my father wanted to keep rewriting history, he was going to have to do it without the evidence he had hidden away for years. As I turned to leave, I felt the shift in the air before I heard the voice. My father stood in the doorway. He didn't look surprised. He looked tired. And for the first time in my life, I realized he wasn't invincible. He was just a man, flawed, selfish, and, in this moment, completely and utterly powerless. I walked past him without a word. For once, he didn't try to stop me. By the time I stepped out into the morning sun, I felt something I hadn't in years. Freedom. The legal battle that followed was quick. My father had spent his life carefully constructing a world where he always won. But this time, the evidence was undeniable. The will was real. The estate was legally ours. His power, his control, it crumbled the moment the truth came to light. He didn't fight. Not really. I think some part of him knew the game was up. Linda filed for divorce a week later. She moved out quietly, leaving behind the remnants of a life she had probably never truly belonged to. I don't think she was ever happy in that marriage. Maybe she had once believed in the illusion my father created, but by the end, she saw him for what he was. She told me once, in a brief conversation over coffee, that she wished she had left sooner, that she wished she had fought back earlier. But I told her the truth. Sometimes, people aren't ready until they're ready. And that's okay. My father disappeared from the public eye after that. No more board meetings, no more social events where he played the role of the successful businessman. He became a ghost in his own empire, a relic of the past that no one spoke about. I didn't see him again after the legal battle ended. I didn't need to. Some things aren't worth salvaging. Ryan's letter sat on my desk for a long time. I read it over and over, his words a constant reminder that he had fought for the truth even when no one believed him. And in the end, that truth had won. I used my share of the inheritance to turn our mother's house into something new. A place for people like Ryan, people who had been cast aside, ignored, forgotten. A community space, a resource center. A place where voices wouldn't be silenced. Because silence had cost us too much already. The first time I stepped inside after the renovations were complete, I felt it, peace. Not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that comes from knowing that, At last, justice had been served.